welcome to this afternoon's plenary. It's gangs and the decolonisation question. What I'd like to do, well, first of all, introduce myself. I'm Paul Andell. I'm an associate professor, criminology at the University of Suffolk in the UK. In a moment, I'm going to ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves, because in the interest of time, I'm sure you want to hear more from them than you do about me, and it would also give good opportunity for you all to ask plenty of questions. So we've got four very distinguished speakers, each bringing a nuanced analysis to assist us excavate the issues of gangs and the decolonial question. Arguably, it's joining the dots between standpoint subalternism and the causal tendencies which sit below this. Or as Jane mentioned this morning, uncovering the myopia of the past to create the inclusive knowledge production and practices for the future. I would like to invite each of the speakers to introduce themselves, speak for 15 minutes. I'll give a 2-minute warning, and then at the end of the panel, we'll have 15 minutes to have questions and answers. So can we give a round of applause to welcome our first speaker, Dr. David Brotherton.
Hi. So, welcome everybody. I'm Professor Brotherton from here, John Jay, even though I've been banished for 12 years from the PhD program. I'm just decloning it by teaching. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a bit about, I'm going to do basically what hasn't been done before, is talk about my research involvement with somebody I've been involved with since 1996. You might call it a longitudinal ethnography of 27 years. And I have about 2 or 3 projects going on. One has lasted 27 years, but the other one has lasted 21 years. And people say, how the hell, why? Because most research projects last after about 5 years. And my decolonial answer is that when I go out into the field, quote unquote, and I work with communities, we co-create the research project. And so the people I study, the people I research, I work with, always is from a premise that the knowledge we produce, that's what Vivian, has to go back to the community to be part of a social change project. Whether that social change happens over the short term or the long term, I'm not particularly interested. I'm there for the long haul, out of an ethic and a political principle of solidarity. So when people ask me about the colonizer and the colonized through the lens of the gang, I'm always reminded of this by somebody probably most of you never heard of, a few probably have, maybe historians, called Smedley Butler. He's the most important person you've probably never heard of. This is what he said in his memoir. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national city bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. I was rewarded with honours, medals, promotion. Looking back on it, I feel I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate in 3 city districts. We Marines operated on 3 continents. So Smedley Butler was the head of the Marines through the 1920s and 1930s, and he actually helped stop the coup against FDR in the 1930s to stop his New Deal. We need a perspective when dealing with such historical antinomies. You need an angle, a point of view, because the canvas is always so much bigger than the ethnographic eye suggests. You need almost a third eye. In this paper, I'm going to discuss part of a life history of someone I've been working with for nearly 3 decades. His name is Antonio Fernandez, aka King Tone, and someone who epitomizes this asymmetrical struggle between the colonizer and the colonized via the medium of the street gang. I'm sitting in a federal courtroom in 1999. About 100 feet away sits King Tong, next to his lawyer, the ponytailed Ron Kubi. Behind him, filling the pews, are about 100 members of his group, kings and queens, all dressed in that black and gold regalia. The air is tense, you can cut it with a knife. It's heavy with dismay and foreboding because it's the day we always knew was coming but didn't want to accept. Like the colonizers were going to miss a beat or something. They didn't. And the truth is, they never do. Not in this country. The prosecutor is going on and on about how Tone is a full-on gangster, no holds barred, who uses his gang to make illegal dollars in the drugs trade. Sure, he puts on a good show that he's a reformer, etc., etc., but this is all a front. In reality, he's a user and abuser of his people. Just another gangbanger. The judge, Judge Regia, seemingly is not convinced. She looks at Ron Kubi after his statement and asks for his response. Ron Kubi rises and says that Tone was a leader of his people and did all the right things, but he slipped and succumbed to temptation. And like many before him, got involved under enormous economic pressure in illegal activities and pleads guilty. Legally, he's been caught in possession of and selling a small amount of heroin to someone who set him up by another who set him up, who was a king who was facing 15 years. It's the same old story. Then the judge makes a statement that contradicts the prosecutor. No, Tone is not a major drug dealer. In fact, based on all the evidence, quote unquote, he played no significant role in the drug trade. And, quote, there is no evidence of any kind of violence that was involved in his drug dealing. She then asks King Tone for his plea, which is guilty, and then explains she has no choice under the guidelines but to sentence him to 12.5 years in prison. There are gasps from the audience. Some people start to cry. It is a moment of disbelief as this conjuncture in colonial time, in effect, announces right then and there it is the end of an era. Giuliani's got what he wanted in the first city in the world to practice that policy of race and ethnic cleansing called zero tolerance. Gangs like the Bloods, the Crips and the Latin Kings do not need sewing lessons, he said. They started in prison and they belong in prison. This prince of perfidy during the Trump era got what he wanted and there would be no fucking Black Panthers in New York City during his reign. So Tone licks his wounds and is transferred back to the top floors of MCC, Manhattan Correctional Centre, also known as the Tombs, where the terrorists are held, and ironically placed between two ex-cops of nationwide infamy, Charles Schwartz and Justin Volpe, of Abner Louima fame, for the broomstick/plunge incident of August 19, 1997. That's the night at the 70th Precinct in Brooklyn, Volpe shoved an object up Louima's rectum in the bathroom and later walked through the building bragging, "I took a man down tonight." What a supreme irony this is, as it relates to me in a phone call. Guess which motherfuckers are each side of me? I should add that the day after the full sodomy, Louima was taken by police to an emergency room where they explained to the nurses their perp had been involved in an abnormal homosexual activity. Louima would undergo 3 operations, removing his spleen, spending a total of 3 months in hospital before being released. Volpe got 30 years and is still in prison, and Schwartz got 15. But back to Tom. I'm going in there with points, but I'm not a violent offender. I know they're going to try and fuck with me. It's the BOP after all. But I've got rights. Right, Dave? How much are they going to do to me? At the time, we didn't know, but we did know that he's a symbol of what the colonised world could do to insurgents. He's not just another gang leader. He's also the son of Luis Felipe, King Blood, who just 2 years ago received the most severe prison sentence of any federal inmate since World War II. 150 years, including 45 years in solitary at Florence, the nation's most secure prison. They've burned him alive, Tone used to intone. They don't do that to Gotti. In time, we see what they had in store for this Inca of the Puerto Rican and Dominican street outcasts. His first stop is Leavenworth, the oldest security federal prison in the United States, located in Kansas. Built in 1860, the nation's most venomous have all been there. The Birdman of Alcatraz, James Earl Ray, Machine Gun Kelly, Whitey Bulger, have all passed through its doors. Plus it has the Dog Pound, the infamous SHU Special Housing Unit in the dungeons of the facility, and that's exactly where Tone is sent. After several months without a word, I receive a letter from Tone. He draws a picture of himself with long hair and a beard, and he looks like Jesus. Describes what it's like in this hellhole. He says he's going crazy. The isolation, the inhumane treatment. Of course, he can only say so much, and I'm surprised even this much is allowed. And he implores me to contact Kubi, to have him protest at this blatant discrimination. They say I'm here for my protection. They say Latin kings are going to kill me. It's all bullshit, you know that. 9 years later, when I visited him in the medium security prison in Ohio, he talked about this time and the 2.5 years he spent being moved from shoe to shoe every 6 months. They would put me there for that time because they don't have to explain why I was there. They didn't have to say that the plan all along was to break me, punish me, and kill me if they have to. I then go on. Oh, there it is. Sorry. It's part of the long life history, but I'll try to be on time. And I'm going to read about 3 pages of 3 or 4 life histories that I've done with him over the last 4 years. And this is just his lessons. He talks about his prison time. And then I'll finish on that. And then I'll just say one thing about what happened to him when he was released. Resilience in the Inferno. If us, who are doing little 3 to 6 years, are telling you a horror story, Imagine when that's where you go to live. You're never going to get a ladder. You're never going to get outside influence, i.e. visits. And nobody could check on you. I saw people eat their shit. I saw people fucking cut other people's pieces off their bodies. I've seen officers lose their patience to the point where they drop grenades in a cell. Do you get it? A blast grenade in a 12-foot by 6-foot cell. Do you know what force feeding is? Look at a documentary. That's a daily sound for me. Beatdowns? Ha ha! What the fuck? Tone describes what it's like to live in and through this hell on earth. This biblical court of my life, as he refers to it. Deep in the crevices of a system that has clearly little to do with rehabilitation and everything to do with unremitting punishment, institutional power, and the crossing of the human spirit. He has spent his time in his younger days in Rikers Island, the infamous jail of New York City, that for many years was the largest penal colony in the world. But this is incarceration and deprivation of liberty on another level. Nonetheless, he refuses to be reduced to a number by a system founded in 1930 that ceases to have any legitimacy in his eyes. I'm talking about the federal prison system. For months they tried to make me say my number and not my government name. All around him he sees and hears needless, irrational, humiliating sanctions against his fellow inmates and the sounds of human suffering and madness that become everyday background noise as he sits alone in his post-industrial concrete cell with perspex windows painted black so he cannot communicate through his supposed gang signs. He contemplates his options to rise above it all, to stay alive, stay sane. He decides that all of this penal living, the workings of the institution, his becoming an inmate, the groups and subcultures within which he is intrinsically involved are food for thought, while he is interned in this one part of a vast bureaucratic complex that sucks over $9 billion per year from taxpayers to maintain its 11 penal institutions, 36,000 employees and 130,000 inmates. Thus, submission and conformity are the names of the game. Relinquishing one's identity and only being known as a cipher is a demand of a system that cannot allow any thoughts of a challenge to its philosophical regime and obsessive control of time. As Foucault long ago argued, the penitentiary is no longer just about the surveillance of the body, but more about the disciplinary occupation of the soul, the institutionalization of the mind through the norms of confinement and the ideology of domination and subjugation that draws on the traditions of slavery, colonization, social exclusion, convict labour, and yes, working class formation. Tone, therefore, resolves to absorb the punishment while making contact with the inmates that he respects, like Oscar Lopez, the renowned Puerto Rican nacionalista who refused to acquiesce to US imperialism. In an extraordinary act of courage based on inmates' respect for this man of the revolution, he saves Tone's life in the yard at Terre Haute on emerging from the shoe for the first time. Oscar Lopez saved my fucking life, along with other strangers that seen me on HBO, because I stood by Luis Felipe's side, because I was involved in the political movement, because I cared about Puerto Rico. Little did I know that connection in the street would save my life when the BOP tried to get me killed. You know what happened after they closed the yard? They walked me to the shoe and transferred me out of Terre Haute. Oh, Jesus Christ, I could go to story after story. Oscar goes on to mentor Tone and advised him that to survive, he needs to do the virtually free labour in the prison unicorn work programme. This will provide Tone with an alternative space to the yard where he will be inevitably threatened, and maybe the next time he will not be so lucky. Meanwhile, the leaders of Lahame tell him his job is to stay out of prison, never to come back for his work on the outside is too valuable. Then there is the teacher who recognises his potential and shows him how to construct whole written sentences despite his severe dyslexia that was never diagnosed in high school. He showed him how to pass his GED in prison and enabled him to both build and free the mind while he awaits his release date, providing he does nothing to add to his sentence. And I think, Tone says, that's how I conquered all the lies and status of the shoe. People who met me as I travelled through these prisons said, this motherfucker don't lose his cool. He's about his business, and he's not a snitch. He's even got his paperwork. You get it? So he goes through prison, he does 10 years, and he comes out in Virginia, not far from Charlottesville, where they had, the white supremacist protests in 2017. And he goes to join his wife. And before he goes to join his wife, he thinks when he's moved to Virginia that he's actually going to be released. And instead they put him in a jail and stick him back in a shoe inside the jail. So he spends another year there, and because he's seen as a threat to the public, and he eventually comes out. This is what happens. Leaving the jail, getting to my wife's house, they were waiting for me in front of her house. Put me in the cop car like I did something wrong. They took me to the precinct. They stripped me naked and took fucking pictures of my whole body. I was standing like a doll with no clothes in front of men I never met. And I'd just be taking pictures of everything. And they, instructed me on how it was going to be there. So after that encounter, I tried to go get work. And then through my daughter, I found out that gang intelligence were going to community members, community high schools, and informing them that I had been released into the community and that I was a threat to recruit. So it was a way to get rid of me, not to let me survive, even though I was home. That's it.
I guess.
You don't have to.
I was going to say comfortable here.
I go back and forth?
Yeah.
I'll go up. Why not? Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. The topic of this presentation is the late modern gang, the late modern gang. I'm trying to answer the question here, what is it? What is the quintessential late modern gang? What is the ideal type, the dominant type? What is something that appears in the late modern period that can't appear in the modern or pre-modern period? And so one way to go about this question is to define the late modern and look at what's unique about it. Sure, thank you. So since I'm dealing with questions of labeling, identifying, questions of perspective, right? How you differentiate youth gangs from cultures and individual criminality versus group criminality and so on. I thought David Reisman's definition is the most useful. And that is to say that he understands in the late modern period an other directed type, and this other directed type is very anxious and very preoccupied with the judgments of other people, similar to his pre-modern version, right? Pre-modern people had to deal with each other all the time. And pre-modern people, because they had to deal with each other all the time, there was in place an effective system of social control, right? Like you couldn't just go to the next village and get another standard of judgment for approval. And the world is kind of closed in on us, according to David Reisman. We become parochial again because we can't escape judgments, but we don't have what pre-modern people had, which is the opportunity to make judgments on the basis of actual knowledge and experience. We're making snap judgments. Our encounters are increasingly superficial, that's his language. And the pace of atomization, the pace of separation, of the dissolution of the social bond, of all these things he's preoccupied with has picked up. And I think that's also a fair thing to say about the late modern, is that it has simply picked up the pace of what's already going on. But then, I'm through now defining the late modern, because that's not my task here, right? Like, I just want to give you some working ideas. But I do think that what's happened in the late modern is discontinuity. If we're going to compare the modern gang, right, which is the 20th century gang, to what is happening now, and now being post-World War II, right, or mark it, a few years later, if you're more comfortable marking it in the onset of the neoliberal period, late 1960s, early 1970s. Either way, and that's debatable too, but what's not debatable is that there was a modern gang, despite all its differences, internal contradictions. And for those of you that know me, I have repeatedly said in every venue, there is no such thing as gangs in general, right? But, it depends on what kind of distance we have. And from the distance from, 100 years later, we look back and we think the 1920s gangs had a lot in common, despite the fact that there were huge differences, right? The 1930s gangs had a lot in common with the 1920s gangs, whites gangs with thrashers gangs, right? The 1950s gangs, which were approached mostly theoretically, right, not empirically, and mostly using Mertonian concepts, in fact, had a lot in common with the other two dominant forms, 1930s and 1920s. But then you have a break. Like that, then continuity breaks, right? And when you think of what that means, right, for continuity to break, for there to be discontinuity, I am suggesting that what made the early to mid 20th century gang modern, quintessentially modern, was its continuity with tradition, with traditional society. And that was identified directly, inadvertently, in all kinds of ways, first by the Chicago School, right? So Thrasher tells us that gangs are interstitial, and meaning in between, right? And the host culture, the parent culture, the tradition, the modern, the young, the old, the gangster, the legit guy, and so on. So he's assuming, right, that Italian kids are really bringing Italian norms. Like, they really are doing that. And if they form a little subculture, it's some version of Italian something or another, the Romans, the Knights, etc., right? He assumes no such thing as second-generation immigrants breaking with the customs of the old country. In fact, it grounds them, right? But even as they're trying to break into the new world, and Thrasher's brilliance, I think, is in describing the gang as a vehicle for Americanization, notwithstanding the fact that he called it stymied Americanization and assumed it wasn't the best or the truest version still, right? He gave the kids, he attributed to them a sense of purpose as opposed to just simply opportunism or lack of impulse or whatever else people have been going on about recently. They tried to make their environment meaningful, and they tried, more importantly, to navigate a very problematic environment, right? It wasn't just described as an innocuous backdrop, 1920s Chicago. It wasn't just poverty and dysfunctional this or the other. It was lurid, it was seductive, it was demoralizing, right? It was depressing, it was exciting. I mean, he calls the young kids pioneers. They're in the unknown, moral and cultural pioneers in a new frontier, right? And they got no map, and this is what makes them exciting and sociologically interesting, if we could use that language, right? Not auxiliary police work, but by the fact that we're watching young people recreate life in a new context and embrace it, in fact, and create solidarity and all these things that are amazing, right? So look at, but something then I have to say about us. And that us observers, the observers of the gang, right? So now I'm talking about the gang, and I can trace it into the 1950s as a quintessentially modern phenomenon because of its continuity with the past. But what about us? What about the observer? We're not the same people. We don't have the same preoccupations. We're not being evaluated by the same standard when we write down our observations and share them with our colleagues. We don't get promoted on the same terms or funded, et cetera, right? I couldn't use any of Thrasher or White's language, even Merton's language, to get any kind of money, maybe bus fare, right? But I could use Malcolm Klein's language, and I could use the language of Jankowski, and I could use the language of Padilla, and I could use the language of Hoff, and I could use certainly the language of Knox, and I certainly could use the language of all the neoclassical people that rediscovered Durkheim via Hershey. Any one of them will do interchangeably, in fact. That's not, that's not going to. So what about us, right? What about us? So the question I want to put before you is, have gangs changed, and if so, how? And how would we know, apart from us changing, right? Like the observers who are ever changing are trying to talk about the changes in an object world. And I think like we just take for granted that that's a simple two-step, like a barn dance or something, there's no instructions to this thing, right? You're observing something moving with a vehicle, a method, a lens that is itself moving, And so I would say the answer to the question of whether gangland has changed substantially or instead the representations of its observers have changed is that both have happened. But not because gangs in general, quote unquote, become more organized. These are the leading arguments produced by the US Justice Department. I'm just going to give them to you straight. They can be found, for instance, in the gang threat assessment reports, which began in 2009, then 2011, then 2013. And then in 2015, we got half a report with the promise that something more would come, and then they just dropped it. But they still collect data and disseminate it about gangs. That data, by the way, is completely impressionistic for those of you that don't know. It doesn't correlate with arrests, it doesn't correlate with prison population, it doesn't correlate with formal charges, it doesn't correlate with anything. It's a product of surveys that are administered to police precincts, and internally those precincts decide who will fill out the survey. That's all. Could be the guy doing desk duty, could be a gang expert, could be anything, and we're not told that. And so the guys ask questions. Do you think you have gangs? How big, and et cetera, right? So tick, tick, tick the boxes, and then that looks like hard data. It's sort of like the joke about sausages being made, right? It's like that. And then we got phenomenal numbers, like the biggest increase, which is the one that Trump used against Obama, was the increase of 1 million gang members in 2011 in the United States to 1.4 million. That's according to the FBI and the US Justice Department. In 2 years, they told us that gangland increased 40%. And then all Trump did was say this happened under Obama, right? In fact, all he was doing was quoting the FBI. So no, not like they're saying. They're saying the gangs are growing bigger, they're becoming more criminally sophisticated, they're becoming transnational, they're forging links with terrorist organizations, they're doing all of these things. And I suggest there's not a word of truth in any of that. And yet these types of definitions are effective. They inform the Eurogang definition, by the way. And now the two are doing a feedback loop, right? Like the FBI is adjusting to Eurogang and Eurogang's adjusting to FBI. They're linking, the US Justice Department is linking articles now that are produced by Eurogang research and select research in the United States, the usual suspects, right? And so I suggest that's not it. Rather, it's because the traditional gang of traditional criminology maintained continuity with pre-modern culture, and that included the commitment to the idea of work. I want to provide one further qualification, which is that the modern gang is an industrial gang. The modern gang is an industrial gang, and the observers of the modern gang are wittingly or unwittingly industrial thinkers. They are good thinkers for the industrial period. They are focused on industry as a problem and a solution. When it comes right down to it, you could go member by member of the Chicago School, and each one and all of their beautiful tracks and you know, poetic flourishes and what have you, posit workaday life as a solution. That's it. You know, great big descriptions, you know, 600-page books, right? And that is, and each one has the same solution, right? Each version of industrial sociology, criminology that approaches the gang, meaning all modern gang criminology, posits the workaday life as a solution, right? Even White, you know, he says, Chick, you know, got out of the gang world, and then the depression made him jobless and brought him back to the streets. There you go, you know, straightforward, right? And I think that there's a real problem there. I mean, I know that Chicago School sociologists have been accused of having a blind spot toward race, even having a simplistic concept of class. But I think the biggest collective failure is in addressing what work means in American society, right? Like anyway, so in the work of Shaw, in the work of Shaw and McKay, there's an explanation of this problem about work. They say that in modern society, young people can't work. And that's provided, like we have labor laws, right? There are no labor laws in traditional societies. So in modern society, we have labor laws. And that means that you have a lot of young kids, and they're working class kids, and they can't work. But meantime, they have no interest in school, and school has no interest in them. And that's when they're getting in trouble, right? I assume a lot of people know that in the 1920s, it was common for young working class men in particular to get in trouble and do the gang stuff while they were in school. So it's, you know, the best way to get them to stop would be to get them out of school and you know, give them a kick into workaday life, right? Now it's exactly the opposite. If you want them to go into secondary deviance and, you know, a career path in crime, just kick them out of school, right? There's not the workaday life waiting for them. So, okay, so we got young kids now who are killing time in school and getting in trouble and then waiting to pretty much walk into a factory, right? Like, you know, despite all the mythology, the American dream, that's how the middle class grew. That's how immigrants were assimilated for the most part, you know. And I don't know, a lot of us are nostalgic for those days. I mean, think about what that means, right? That we're nostalgic for that brutality, right? But it was a solution, to be sure. Even the radical historian Mike Davis said, give me 50,000 jobs and I'll convert 50,000 gang members to industrial workers. I can't argue with him. I think he is exactly right. I just don't think that should be our goal. I don't think that should be our goal. So let's see here. So in the works of Shaw and McKay, like Thrasher, here's something now that's changing in us, independent of the gang world. This is us. You see no cynicism. These are not cynical people. They don't write ironically when they describe things in the community that they understand to be solutions, including the workaday world, right? The exploitative factory. They don't speak ironically. They don't speak critically. When they talk about the church, they don't speak ironically. They don't speak critically. When they talk about the family, they don't speak ironically. They give straightforward, non-ironic statements that, you know, embody solutions, right? So they say things like the kid who gets the wholesome teaching from the church, the school, and the family, you know, is good. Wholesome teaching, right? It's not as if we're talking about idiots, right? We're talking about very smart people, and in the case of Shah, with very strong progressive political credentials, right? So no naivete, but no cynicism either. So yeah, there is something wholesome, but it's the way to conformity and banality, you know. It's the way to kill all the things that he was, you know, validating a few pages before. And it's also contradictory, right? It's because the church is messed up. They knew that, right? The families were messed up, and they were already described as messed up. That the key focus of the disorganization concept was the family, right? Not able to properly supervise the kids. And then, but they say next to that, you have the demoralizing influences on the street, and then so they come up with this idea of cultural transmission. I don't have time in today's presentation, but I can tell you that the word values is the most problematic word in our entire discourse, both sociology and criminology. It's in my mind, it's thrown in there when we got nothing else to say. You know what I mean? Like, well, there's a gap there. We don't know how to explain why somebody's doing what they do, right? Because it's not utilitarian, it's not, you know, impulsive, it's not, what do you say? Okay, values. Throw values in there, it looks good. But ask yourself if most of what's described as values can't be described 3 other ways, you know, including like fear-based motivation or just simple opportunism or your friend, whatever, you know. I mean, value is a very strong term. And compare the way Durkheim, you know, some thinker like this, right, Zimmel or somebody, the way they used values, right? Like values are, you know, sacred, taken out of circulation, you know, part of your identity. They're not just like things that orient you toward fighting and stealing, right? And so anyway, so we have bad explanations. There is no such thing as cultural transmission, right? There is no robot here and a robot there and that can transmit one thing to the other, right? There is no such thing as automatic anything passing values. In fact, there's no such thing even in the functionalist corpus. I think Garfinkel's critique of it for producing an over-socialized concept of man is absolutely right, and that was, anyway, wasn't the first one to do it, but you get my point. Like, you know, we just assume too much. People internalize values, and then they become puppets. They go do what they do. And if they internalize values in the context of a deviant subculture, then they go do deviant stuff. But this is just so wrong. It is so wrong for so many reasons, right? Because first of all, it would assume that anybody can just get up in the morning and live out their values. And I'd like to. Did anybody do that today, by the way? You know, I didn't, because I'm in New York, right? So you don't get to do that too often in New York. You have to kind of navigate the environment, compromise a little bit. So there is a movement, right, there is a movement around a concept of work, and I want to connect it to subculture in a second. I don't want to take too long. Niederhoffen, Cohen, Merton, all these people assume implicitly a modern version of deviance, even though Merton is dealing with atomized people, right, not groups. Other people would link him, like Cohen, Cloward and Olin, I should say. But Merton was able to identify the key role of symbolism, I think, better than the Chicago School. I think so. And I say that because much is made about the fact that some manifestos and drawings and representations were found in that culture, right? Deviant youth subculture, street gangs, and so on. but in my estimation, not enough. It was very flippant. You'd move on, you know, like you state it, you'd move on. There's no real analysis of that stuff. Whereas in Merton, there really is. And in particular, it's my very favorite line from Merton, where he talks about the progressive absence of differential class symbols of success. And here's why that's important to me, because now he's put two things in dialogue, right? He's put the deviant group in dialogue with the mainstream group. He's put the deviant group, which has its own symbols, right? Not necessarily values. Like, what is Merton saying about values? He said they got the same values as everybody else. That's what's causing the problem. That's what's causing the problem, is that they're like everybody else. They're materialistic, they want things, and they look down on people. That's what's causing it, right? Not that they have deviant values, but that they are conformist, right? But then Merton says, you know, they're in dialogue with each other. I mean, he doesn't use that language, but I think we should. I think we're concerned about reaction, cultural reaction. I think that's better than embracing notions of, like, Sutherland's notion of a culture of deviance, right? But I think we're missing something if we don't understand that there is a dialogue between mainstream and deviant groups and authorities and so on that involve heavily symbolism and images. Yes? You. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. So trying to take control of images is, I think, what we need to look at as people that research gangs now in the late modern period. The people that I interviewed were preoccupied, mostly Latin kings, a while ago, not new research. We're preoccupied only with symbols. Didn't matter what I talked to them about in terms of ideas, right? Like, the leadership would give you ideas, and King Tone that David was just talking about, you could give him like Karl Marx, you know, or Howard Zinn, and he'd synthesize like the people's history and the Communist Manifesto, right? But that's not what the rest were doing. But the rest would imitate something, like they would kept using this language, standing up and, you know, and not compromising and, you know, showing people and so on, right? And so when I would ask them, like, what do you understand by this stuff, by your politics, right? I kept getting symbolism. I wanted words, and I'd get symbolism, right? Like, so tell me why. What do you understand by Marxism? What's that? I don't care. I like the Young Lords. Yeah, but they were Marxists. You know, I don't care. Is that true? Yeah, I don't care. You know, but they were, you know, whatever, right? So what do you like about the Young Lords if you don't understand, you know, their platform or what it means, or their internal divisions, the Trotskyists fighting the Maoists, and then the Puerto Ricans, you know, separatist faction and so on, right? You don't understand any of that. So why you like them? And it turns out they like him because the symbol is beautiful, it's strong. The symbol is of standing up. And I'm not saying this flippantly or dismissively, right? I'm saying this is real, it's powerful, right? Like this, you know, people told me one after another, the symbol. I mean, they didn't say the symbol, they said stand up. They stood up. And that's what I'm doing. I'm standing up, you know, and there's no point even in asking, standing up to what? Because there are so many things that are knocking you down. And recognition of that fact is what provides a basis of solidarity, right? Is what provides a basis of solidarity. So other symbols, the berets. Other symbols, the pig. The pig has never left us. The Black Panthers put in their weekly newspaper a cartoon of a pig, put it in a police uniform, and that symbol has never left this culture in its public mind, in its you know, in its anything. And I'm telling you, the young people know this stuff. They get it, and there's a seduction to it, right? We're looking now, I think, at more hybrid groups, like of the kind that Roger Matthews wrote about in Nicaragua, of the kind that Burgos wrote about in Brazil, where political groups become criminal, criminal become political. You just keep having these new things form, reform, and reform. There is no more modern gang that stays there for us to examine and go back to and go back to and go back to. The late modern gang is more lucid, its boundaries are more porous, it's more willing to join forces with other groups, it's more willing to do all kinds of things, right? And membership now is very strange, because a lot of young people now can belong to several. Did you guys know that? In New York, you can belong to 3, 4 different gangs, right? As long as they're not enemies of each other. You know, you could be a king and a blood, but you can't be a king and association yet, you know, things like this, right? But you can go 4 or 5 of them, right? So the expressivity, the symbols, is what we need to concern ourselves about, and to recognize our own conversation, and to recognize ourselves as part of a conversation, I should say. And finally, I would add this, that the strategies that I see, Operation Crown and the big ones, right, like take out the head, you know, it's not just here, it's Chicago, it's Los Angeles, right, take out the head. What's happened is the gangs are still there, but they're not visible, meaning they're not representing, they're underground, right? They're not rocking collars, they're not, you know, doing graffiti and so on, and so good. And that means also, if we don't see them, and we just kind of hear about them, which is when you see a murder, right? You hear a murder, right? You don't hear about anything else. So they freak you out. They become an object of fear, right? But there's also an aspect, you know, if you let it play out differently, where they become an object of fascination. And then if you get close to them, you develop empathy, you know, to advance the conversation, right? We're all in it together in some sense. But I think integral to this cutting off the head strategy is silencing, wiping out what I've just discussed, right? Wiping out the subcultural and countercultural representations, wiping out the grievances that are embodied in that, wiping out the forms of solidarity that develop around that. And the end result is you get something like MS-13, you know, and I think the cops really love MS-13. I really do, because there's nothing confusing about it. It terrorizes its own. It terrorizes and threatens its own, even back in El Salvador. And so, you know, it's a group that it's very easy to demonize, to pathologize, and so on. Whereas the gang members themselves are busy providing non-criminal reasons for gangs, even the ones that involve crime, because they want solidarity. They don't want just opportunism or fear, right? The other gangs, the Crips, the Bloods, and so on and so forth. So I think I should just stop, and later if people want to take questions, I'll answer it there. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. My name is Adeem Suhail. I am not a criminologist, so don't blame me if this doesn't make sense, okay? All right. So another reason why this might not make sense is because my field site is not in the US, although I worked with a few friends from the streets in Atlanta, where I lived for 10 years. I just learned one of my comrades passed away during the COVID-19 pandemic. I moved to Pennsylvania, so Brother Harun, yeah, we miss y'all. So I work in this neighborhood called Liari, which was sort of one of the most notorious ganglands in the city of Karachi, which is, if statistics are to be believed, and they're not, the third largest city in the world by population. It's like around 27 million people in there. So Liari, when I say it's like the smallest neighborhood in the city of Karachi, roughly around 1.5 million people live in there. This is the smallest township in the city. And that's where I did most of my field work. Now, when I went up in there beginning in 2012, I found what you see on the picture on the right, which is that the Pakistani military had taken over Liari town, right, and had sort of surrounded it, and they encircled it, and then sort of they closed in, right? And over the course of the next 3 years, as I was doing my fieldwork there was what was called the highest intensity of the Liari gang war, and on the right there are police record tallies. So not to be believed, not to be taken at face value, but those are the mortalities, right? So people who died in the Liari gang war every year, and this is sort of when they started keeping records, apparently, because there was nothing for before 2009. But I was there chronicling the end of the gang in between 2013 and 2015, right? And the Pakistani military went and they rendered desaparecido or incarcerated or just killed many of these young ethnically Baloch who are often black-presenting gang members. So this becomes important. And so the question that I started asking was, everybody told me that the gangs actually emerged on the scene in 2002, right? So this was the lifespan, right? So they rose really fast to end up controlling this key area. And if you can see, this is important, that the area of Liari is right next to the Karachi port, right? So they are all the dock workers live in that zone, right? This is key, right? So one of the things that I was asking was, this area is characterized by the Pakistani military as sort of being a no-go zone, a no man's land where absolute lawlessness prevails, right? There's no writ of the Pakistani state there between 2002 and when the gangs were downgraded in 2015. So why did they rise up in 2002, right? So how does a place become a violent gangland, right? And so for that, I realized that it had everything to do with the fact that the docks were close by, that most of the dock workers lived in this neighborhood, and that it connected Pakistan to the Arabian Sea and to regional polities, right? It's kind of a trade hub, and it's one of the most important trade hubs, even for China's access to the Western Indian Ocean and to sort of the markets to the west of it, right? So what I realized very quickly was that the answer may not simply lie in a deep study of the neighborhood itself, but actually might lie at multiple layers, abstracting away from the ground, right? And indeed, my finding was that the rise of the gangs in Liari was tied to Pakistan's involvement in the war on terror, right? And I divide that time, this life cycle of the gang between 2002 and 2015 into two parts, right? Whereas the first part is the nice part, right? It's that, and it really is nice, and sort of it answers some of the questions that were raised in the talk prior to mine, which is what is a gangster, right? And so this was one of the most prosperous times for Liari, actually, despite sort of all of those police records showing casualties, right? And in that time, between 2002 and 2013, the gangsters brokered some of the highest levels of development in this highly, highly poor, marginalized, working class zone in the city of Karachi. Right? So there were urban beautification processes. For the first time, many parts of this neighborhood were connected to the sewage system. Many parts of the neighborhood were not electrified, and they got electricity at this time. There were parks. There were giant investments in sports infrastructure. Right? The gang rule oversaw the change of girls' participation in primary education from 29% of the population to 67% of the population, right? And so these were intense gains, right? And then 2013 to 2015, the time when I was there, was a time in which the gangs were being murdered basically in the street every day by the Pakistani military, which had descended onto the street in the name of ordering the city, right? So this is a violent, no-good gangland, and we must reclaim it, right? The writ of the Pakistani state must return onto the streets, right? What allowed me to sort of think through these two, sort of like, how does this happen? What is this life cycle, and why does it flip around 2012, 2013? I I wanted to think about what a gangster was on the ground, right? And the gangster in that regard is not what Thrasher and White are perhaps. I take the interstitiality of it all, right? But what are the layers being mediated by this figure called gangster? And in Pakistan, sort of, they call themselves gangster, right? And I tried to use this idea of the cultural broker, right? It's a concept that comes out of the 1950s from Eric Wolf's work, who's a Marxist anthropologist at Columbia University. And he talks about the cultural broker as a kind of a figure who faces in two directions, right? They must serve conflicting interests along different planes of abstraction, right? And they must cope with that, they must absorb the conflict, right? They play this brokerage role by absorbing friction between, say, perhaps classes, according to Eric Wolf, between the working class and the owners of the means of production, right? And but they cannot resolve the conflict, because if they resolve the conflict, they undo their own extremely important, extremely lucrative role as cultural brokers, right? So they can't resolve the conflict, they must continue it, but also attenuate its worst effects, right? And indeed, this was the role that the gangsters were playing in Karachi between 2002 and 2012. And so during this time, gangs were frequently wielding deniable non-state violence in Pakistan for a government which was a military US-backed military dictatorship, right? And so if they needed anything done in the city of Karachi, say a plot of land needed to be cleared of indigenous dwellers, but the military state could not directly sort of get involved, right? Because that would be direct tyranny, other than all the other tyranny that the Pakistani state did. And so they would employ local actors, right? Deniable violence of the gangs. And in that regard, the gangs were articulating, right? So they wielded non-state violence, right? They articulated large-scale processes that we may know as capitalism or state formation, right? Military state formation, and great power hegemony. And this is where the decolonial part of it will come in, right? And in the aftermath of, say, the clearing out of the indigenous people off of their land, or sort of the eviction of whole neighborhoods, so that the military could invest the donor dollars that were coming in from Washington, D.C., they would also then, in the aftermath, go in and do good works, right? So they would go in, the gangs would go in and sort of offer small business loans, create girls' schools. There was a lot of emphasis on girls' education because the boys populated the gangs themselves. And so I wanted to go and look even closer and sort of talk to people about sort of this moment, this initial phase in which the gangs were on the rise, right? Oh, I didn't know this was being recorded. I'm just kidding. Now, General Pervez Musharraf, military dictator who just died in February, may he rot in peace, became a supporter of George Bush's vengeance on the Afghans for 9/11. Right? And the Pakistani state before that was under intense sanctions for its use of sort of nuclear tests, right? And it was a military government, but suddenly they were accepted by Washington, D.C. and given roughly $4 billion a year in military aid, bought in hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives and Pakistani lives, right? So this was the time when this was happening. But what was crucial to Pakistan's participation in US occupation of Afghanistan, and this will continue until 2021 when Biden ends this, right? What's important here is that early on, beginning in November 2001, 70% of the supply lines for the US Army to Kabul and Kandahar, only 2 minutes, are going through the port of Karachi, right? And so they need to be secured, right? And so the military needs a local broker in the city of Karachi. But this broker needs to be a very specific kind of a broker, because right now, unlike the 1980s when the US went and killed Afghans or in the name of sort of driving the Soviet Union out, right? They needed to cultivate Islamists, right? So there were books being written at the University of Nebraska that cultivated the Taliban, that created the Taliban and the Mujahideen, right? But this time around, and so the Pakistani military had been using them as assets to use against India, to infiltrate sort of the government in Afghanistan itself, right? But this time around, when the US goes into Afghanistan, it's against the no good, very bad Islamists, right? And so what kind of a broker do you need on the ground? Well, you need somebody that can at least pretend to be a secular urban proxy, right, on the ground. It can be Islamist, right? So the military cannot use its usual assets. Secondly, you need control over the ports, right? The port pilferage cannot happen, right? This is the US Army, right? It's the big gang. And thirdly, sort of all of that military aid that was coming in needed to be invested in the largest city, the financial hub of Pakistan. And so that had to be secured. Now, these Baloch and Afro-Baloch gangsters were the perfect proxy for that. So it's not like there weren't other gangs around, right? There were other networks. These guys were small fish, right? But they become very important because the Baloch are a very specific kind of a people, right? So let's go into that just a little bit, if you give me just a little bit of grace, because I had to paint a picture, as it were, which is that they are racially and ethnically extremely diverse. The Baloch people, they are not a people simply of Pakistan, right? But they're actually spread all over the Indian Ocean. So they kind of think about the Makrani Baloch, especially the Afro-Baloch, they think of themselves as the dwellers of the Arabian Sea, and the shore is the limits of their territory, right? So they're seaward-looking people, right? Which means that they live on the coasts of Pakistan, Iran, the Persian Gulf states, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, all of them Baloch, and so they speak different languages. Some present as black, other present as South Asian, other present as Arab, but they're tied by ancestral kinship networks, so they have the same stories, right? And you can think about sort of a people that live on the sea and are tied by not, so they don't recognize racial or ethnic difference, but are united by stories, right? And in being in these diverse locales, they acquire different religious traditions and linguistic traditions. But there are people of the sea, so they perform the function of soldiering and sailoring in this zone for centuries, right? For larger imperial formations, right? And so you can see how they're perfect for this job, right? And so what they do in Karachi is actually they divide themselves. So they have ancestral knowledge. They've dealt with the Brits before, they've dealt with the French before, they've dealt with the Portuguese before, right? So what they do is they immediately are able to reorganize themselves into three parts, right? So there is the illicit activities network, right? And these are, so the US allies in Afghanistan, right? The people that we displaced the Taliban with are mostly the people who are running the heroin fields, the poppy fields of Afghanistan, right? And so these allies of the United States, in order to achieve stability in Afghanistan, right, for these warlords, right, their heroin needs to move into the world, right? This is the intranet. This gang actually helps move that through Balochistan into the world, right? And so the head of the gang, the gentleman in the middle, oversees these illicit networks of moving guns and drugs, right? The guns are also old Soviet guns and new American guns. Secondly, they have a large projects and political liaisoning officer, the gentleman on the right who died in a bomb blast after 2 days after I interviewed him. And he was an extremely smart man, but his job was he was meeting with, he was constantly in meetings with the CIA, with the Pakistani ISI, and coordinating the war effort in many ways. And the movement of people and guns and assets in and out of Afghanistan. And the third guy, the one on the left, he's the one who survived. He's still in government right now, actually. And this guy actually undertook some of the most interesting parts of the gangs, right? So the gang infiltrated large development projects in Pakistan and sort of started abetting and sort of starting a real interest in the Chinese investments into Pakistan, right? So again, you think about the idea of the gangster as a broker, and then you suddenly sort of start thinking about sort of, okay, what kinds of processes are they brokering, right? So they're allowing Chinese firms to go into, come into Karachi and sort of have these mega projects, right? They're creating football clubs and girls' education. So that's the guy that I was, and this was my primary interlocutor in the PSE gang. And also I worked, my field work was as a polio vaccinator, right? So they got a lot of Gates Foundation money to do a polio campaign and eradicate polio in the city, right? So this is what they were doing, right? And so you can see that in doing all of these things, they're sort of not performing their role as brokers. They're kind of acting like the government, right? They're kind of, and in fact, this dude in the middle, right? The leader, the gang leader, he wanted to run for office in the 2013 elections in Pakistan. Now, another shift takes place in 2013. This is Obama's second term, right? And so unlike George Bush, who kills his Afghans mano a mano, right, like in person, President Obama kills his Afghans from the air, right? So that whole network, right, that supplies network, it's not important anymore. And these guys are sort of, not acting like a broker anymore. They've fallen on this side where they're sort of acting like a state within a state, right? And so they must be gotten rid of, right? And that's what ushers in the time to die, right? Now, just very quickly, I'm gonna go back to sort of what the professor was saying, right? So what does a decolonial perspective bring to the analysis of gangs in and from Pakistan, right? And for this, I think just like sort of in that tradition of Thrasher and White, like, so we have to be very, very particular about what becomes a gangster in any specific political ecology, right? And so here you'll find multiple articulations of transnational global hegemonic projects articulating sometimes with national military establishments, sort of the national level, country level goals, and then localized brokerage, right? And you'll see in each instance, the same families, the same groups sometimes they appear as tribal chiefs, sometimes they appear as people who are the modern gangsters who are becoming jobbers and who bring labor to the factories, right? They huddle people up and sort of put them in the factories. Then they become trade unionists because the Soviet Union in the 1970s is closer to Pakistan than the US is. And then the gangster, right? Because the US is acting like a gangster. And you see how they meld and move, right? So I'm gonna leave it here, and maybe I can address more questions. There's a few more intricacies to the story, but thank you for listening to me.
Is this your mom?
No, this is not.
Okay.
Let me just close this. If I close this, then...
She's gonna get looked up, so stop sharing. If you can keep it here.
So before I start, I just want to give you all props because it's been a long ass day, so I know everyone's tired. So I'll make mine sweet and short and to the point. So my name's Amy Andrea Martinez, and I can't believe it, but I'm an assistant professor at San Jose State University. I just graduated last August, so this upcoming August will be like the first official year that I've been done. And Dave was my chair, and I had a great time with him. I don't know about my department, but with Dave, we had a good time. So, but no surprise there, right? Small people problems. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself, my interests include Mexican Chicano gang culture, mass incarceration, third world and indigenous qualitative research methods, U.S. settler colonialism, police use of lethal force, and prison police abolition. So even though my doctorate is in criminal justice, I just want to, point out that I do not identify as a criminologist, right? I rather look at myself as an interdisciplinary decolonial scholar studying in the field of criminology. I earned my bachelor's in sociology at UC Santa Barbara, an MA in ethnic studies in Berkeley. But perhaps more importantly, I attribute my inclinations towards ethnic and post-colonial decolonial studies scholarship and philosophies due to the intersections of my identity, right? As a first generation working class and system impacted Chicana from Southern California, where my experiences have largely informed my commitment to decolonial gang research on Mexican Chicanx families and their associations and experiences with gang and street life. My current work is highly inspired and informed by the personal. So 4 months into my first year of undergrad, at UC Santa Barbara, my brother was actually being tried for attempted murder at the age of 13 with gang enhancements, right? So I was able to, unfortunately, witness my brother's trials and tribulations, right? And my family, right, underwent this year-long court battle that was eventually lost. Fortunately, my brother only got 3 years in juvenile hall instead of 25 to life, right? But even then, that was really devastating for me and my family, right? But it really pushed me to think about the structural conditions and racism that permeated our everyday experiences as young Mexican Chicanos growing up in Southern California. And it just so happened at the time that Victor Rios, which I'm pretty sure a lot of you know, a leading scholar in the criminalization of black and brown boys in the US, was conducting a gang project in Santa Barbara. And the study's purpose was to gain an understanding of how small town institutions treat Mexican Chicano gang associated boys and the mechanisms young people respond to various cross-cultural conflicts. And so when I disclosed the situation that was happening with me and my brother, my family, Rios invited me to be a part of that gang project. And that's how I ended up kind of getting acquainted with the homeboys of the east side of Santa Barbara. So it's important for me to note that at the onset because I've been spending the last couple of years especially, right, thinking about how my life and the lives of the boys, young men, and men that I have been studying have really shaped not only my understanding of street organizations and street subcultures, but also how I approach myself and the very people that I'm studying and engaging with. So drawing from sociology, criminology, and post-colonial studies, I've spent the last 14 years of my life, even though I look 15, but I'm in my early 30s now. I've been examining the intersections of US settler colonialism and carcerality with an emphasis on how these apparatuses really help us understand the workings of race, racialization, and criminalization of Mexican Chicano gang-involved boys and men in the US through a critical urban ethnography lens. And I draw heavily on decolonial theory and carceral studies to analyze the inherent contradictions embedded particularly in the city of Santa Barbara's histories of Native and Indigenous elimination and Mexican exclusion, with the city's celebration of its romanticized relationship with its Indigenous, Chicanx, and Mexican origins people in contemporary time. So by situating gangs and gang members within a decolonial framework, it has really allowed me to deconstruct the practices that lead to resilient culture and the formation of gangs among Mexican Chicano boys and men in a suburban setting. Thus, my work expands the growing scholarship in critical gang studies on Mexican Chicanx families and their associations to and experiences dealing with gang and street life issues. And I argue that the racial melancholy or the colonial residue of SB's long history of colonization of Native and Mexican origins people shapes the contemporary hostile racial tensions in Santa Barbara between law enforcement and Mexican Chicano boys and men. Now, that sounds great, right? Like I'm centering decoloniality and coloniality and understanding how the history of Santa Barbara itself shapes the social material conditions of young people, right? But as I've mentioned, I've been truly grappling with the concept of gangs and the decolonial question. And one thing that has really been heavily weighing on my mind is how do we actually practice decoloniality within ourselves and for ourselves, right? Meaning how do we actually approach the people that we're studying and or engaging with, right? We talk a lot about reverting the colonial gaze onto the state, right? And how it creates the conditions for the emergence, formation, and persistence of gangs. But we don't really talk about us, right? And I think that that's kind of been a theme that folks have been touching upon throughout the symposium today, right? So I really kind of want to go off of that and really like have us think about, ourselves, the people who write and produce knowledge about and surrounding gangs and gang members, how do we how can we take the works of, for example, Eleni Dimou's Decolonial Option, Kenneth Sebastian's Leon's call for unfucking criminology, Jennifer Ortiz's critiques on academic doxa, Brotherton's call for centering history in the formation and origination of gangs, and Emma Perez's conceptualization of a decolonial imaginary, and bridging these new ideas from seemingly different fields outside of criminology to challenge the colonial foundations of criminology and sociology. Recently, I published a chapter in Jennifer Ortiz's edited volume on critical and intersectional gang studies titled Towards a Decolonial Imaginary to Re-examine and Redefine Mainstream Definitions of Gangs and Gang Members in America. And the central argument of this paper is that gang scholars should develop and center a decolonial theoretical model to fully deconstruct how coloniality and carcerality converge to create a neo-colonial carceral social order and apparatus that subjects gangs and gang members to a colonial carceral gaze that further positions them as vulnerable human targets of state-sanctioned racial violence as manifest by state police surveillance, police brutality, and incarceration. Sorry, I lost time already. So in solidarity with these critical scholars in the field of criminology, I really aim to focus on the criminogenic and racializing features of capital and the academy that create the social material conditions that lead to the criminalization of vulnerable populations such as gang members. It is only, quote, by articulating areas of intervention for scholars to improve criminological inquiry and depart or unfuck ourselves from the many settler colonial and white supremacist inheritance of our field, end quote, that we can actually critically examine how our, quote, our own works have failed to address the coloniality of our present circumstances, end quote, and our research subjects, right? So the chapter concludes with suggestions for concrete and actionable items to protect the humanity of gang-involved individuals in urban, rural, suburban settings, such as the decriminalization of gang labels, the elimination of gang databases, and the legalization of gangs. But like I said, the question that I've been really thinking about is like, well, what about us? We can do all that work, and it's a very necessary work because it does have life and death implications, for the people that we're engaging with. But are we actually willing to do the work that we need to do on ourselves, right, that self-work, in order to decolonize the way that we approach the people that we're engaging with? And I think that if we were to take the decolonial question seriously, it begins and it requires with us, right, asking ourselves, what is it that we're actually willing and able to do when we insert and assert ourselves in the field? Because when I think about what has allowed me to engage in critical and decolonial thought and praxis, it's very much rooted in my own personal experiences and indirect experiences, having witnessed my brother, be engulfed by the juvenile legal system. So that's not. So, anyways, I think I'm running out of time, but that's kind of a question that I've, would like to offer to y'all: is how do we actually begin with ourselves, in decolonizing our approaches, our philosophies, and how we actually conduct our research ethically? Thank you.
Okay, four fantastic speakers. I'd like to take any questions, direct them to any of the speakers you wish. Would you like to come up, or would you like me to come down?
I just want to hear whatever you didn't have time to say. To you.
Oh, me?
Yeah, like you were like, maybe in the Q&A I can finish. Like, your presentation's amazing. I want to hear more.
Oh, I just. Oh. I'm sorry. I'm still jet lagged. I just came back from Europe, and okay. No. So what I wanted to say was that a lot of the what goes as a gangster, often sort of when you go on the ground. For me, the question became, and this is perhaps like a challenge for all of us really, is that what they forced me to think about is not, when I went looking for gangsters, right? So what does gangsterly activity look like, right? And so what I found sort of in hanging out with the boys is and most of them are boys, they're 16 to 19 years old, is that 99% of the time I was spending in Liari, right, with the boys, was in them helping me do the polio vaccinations, right? And then them helping me. So before George Floyd, there was Mike Brown, right? And so they were muraling because they thought that this is what global gangsterness is, right? And so there was a certain idea of blackness that they associate, because this is what America exports, right? That gangsterness and blackness are coterminous, right? And so for them, certain visual forms and aesthetic forms of embracing their own blackness, which does not quite compute on the ground, right? It's not the same thing. There's no history of racialization of blackness in South Asia, and not in that same way. And so they embraced it positively. And so all over Liari, you saw pictures of, and now you see pictures of George Floyd. At that time, you saw pictures of Mike Brown sort of in that middle of that street in Missouri. And so you find that, okay, like, how do you add this to the discourse, right? And why does this not become gangster, right? And so that completely modifies the frame, and it modifies the kind of a subject that we're dealing with, right? Secondly, just very quickly, the fathers of all of these kids, these absent fathers, were in the 1980s. So in that chart I showed, in the 1980s, these gangsters were not brokering order in Karachi because they were too secular and anti-ethnicist, right? And so they were being killed by the military at that time. They could not be that, right? They were not Islamists. So there's a dead generation in the 1980s there. And you see the same thing happening in places like Guatemala, in El Salvador, in parts of Nicaragua, right? And so I was just thinking about sort of how from the South, right, from these darker corners of the earth, we can sort of find a new way of positing the gangster as a very different kind of a social formation than it has been in the lineages of the gangster as a criminological category, if that makes sense. So thank you.
Who was first?
Shall we dance?
Yeah, let's do it.
I'm so sorry. I'm really bad with names. The lady, I have a really good question for you. I mean, I think it's a really good question. So, in your opinion, what decriminalization of gangs will bring to us, to the society? How will it change the world and probably our look at the gangs itself, if it makes sense?
Wait, you said what will the criminalization?
The
decriminalization.
Yeah.
I was like, criminalization, like, that thing's
Yeah. I'm sorry, English it's my
No,
second
okay.
language.
You're
Yeah.
good, you're good. So I've been really actually inspired by my mentor here, Dave. You know, the radical concept of legalizing like gangs, to me, isn't that radical, right? Because if we look at the origin of some of the biggest gangs in the U.S., like the Latin Kings, you know, even MS-13 originally, right? They had political foundations, right? And of course, because of capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, all these fucked up, you know, social processes, right? Like, I would say that some of the political consciousness that formed these gangs to begin with, right? Gangs, like, has been lost, right? It's been lost over time. You know, we talked a lot about, you know, enslaved folks earlier on today and stuff, and I want to say that, you know, a lot of these, you know, gang subcultures, they've been cut off from their own histories, right? So in still trying to find a sense of identity, purpose, and self-empowerment or self-determination, like, it's been perverted, right? And so it's no wonder we see a lot of gang violence, but that's a symptom of the white conditions in which we live in this society, right? So I think that by, you know, legalizing gangs, right, decriminalizing the label and just the subculture itself, and actually giving the support that these young people need, right? I don't see why they wouldn't be able to continue the works of the Young Lords, of the Black Panthers, of the Brown Berets. You know what I mean? So I think that it has actually huge implications, and it would really benefit our society if it's true that we really want to, you know, decrease violence or, you know, ensure public safety.
Yeah, my question touches upon what you both have talked about, which is sort of the politics of gangs in relationship to the state and capital, because it seems like what your talk is suggesting is the gangs occupy a contingent position. And if that's the case, and then they're just, easily dispensed with, as happening in El Salvador and Ecuador, not without struggle, how do we move gangs in the direction you'd like to see them go, which is as entities that confront power rather than as entities that can be used by power and discarded?
No, the young ones.
The young, thanks, dude. We try. We're still, you know, brown don't frown. So I have like a lot of ideas how we could actually accomplish that. I'm actually working on a piece well, I've been working on a piece for a while now, but I think it starts with like cultural empowerment, you know, like giving people a sense of their history and their identity. So, I mean, my work is on Mexican Chicanos, right? So that's the population I work with. I'm Chicana, like that's the history I know. And like when I'm working with young people, right, I'm not coming in there like meeting them where I want them to be at. I'm meeting them where they're at, right? And just planting seeds of revolution, racial justice, social justice, cultural empowerment, cultural history, right? Starting there and kind of just building them up, you know? I think giving young people access to formal education is a start, but it's not the end all be all, right? A lot of these kids have a lot of trauma with school, right? Because they've been pushed out, right? They've been told that they're not smart, they're not cut out for that, they could be better as mechanics or whatever, right? But I think that there's just so many things we could do, and I wish we had the time to really get into it, but that's kind of where I would start.
Thank you. And the very final question is one for Professor Kontos, for our second speaker.
It's me. Okay, so just briefly, I did a critique of something that I could now call maybe unjustly traditional criminology by binding it to the industrial period. So what would something different look, right? I think that's the question, which I didn't really get a chance to articulate, but I think it would have to pay more attention to meaning-making interpretation as a struggle, not just an individual something or via the group through filters. And but as a collaborative effort on one side against another side, like the NYPD, for instance, is busy trying to silence, not just arrest. So, you know, you produce a statement with grievances, and they say a lot of nonsense, or if they can't say that, they say this is propaganda designed to provide cover, and or they find hidden messages, you know, that mean that somebody's going to be attacked, or right, like this game is never ending. So it's about controlling images, it's about controlling symbols. It's about the kind of thing that Castells was talking about, right? Like a successful flow of information that, you know, flows through assemblages and allows people to make connections and so on. And so I would say, just to wrap up, that we need to move away from gang theory. Like, decolonizing it means to me throwing it out. And I'm not, you know, I mean, if I want to read, like, I really like reading the books that I said, you know, I like reading Thrasher and so on. But you know, I read Thrasher before I knew what criminology meant. Like, I don't need to read them one way or the other, right? And I don't accept the discourses, and I don't think Thrasher himself would have accepted any of the discourses that he's been locked into, right? So I say get rid of it. Get rid of criminology. Stan Cohen said it was becoming, Administrative, was that his, administrative criminology? I think we're way past that now, right? We're way past administrative criminology, and I think we start from scratch, and so we need to read critical theory. We need to read theories about society. We need to bring up political economy into this type of discourse. We need not to have a specialized gang discourse. Nobody should talk about gangs unless they're talking about 5 other things. We need to de-reify the concept gang, and we need all to realize the benefits of being a Marxist. And I wanted to take this opportunity here to say, like, who are we kidding at this point? I mean, what else do you need to see? That's what I'm asking. Okay, thank you.
That's a great